Chapter 15, A Divided Nation, Section 1, The Debate Over Slavery. As the United States starts to expand after gaining new territories, the issue of slavery will follow. We'll start with the Louisiana Territory and the territory of Missouri. Missouri wanted to enter the Union. It had enough population to enter the Union, but it wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. Now, back in these days, both sides of the issue did not want one state to have more than the other. For example, you wouldn't want more slave states than free states or more free states than slave states. So a compromise was needed, and Henry Clay will come up with a compromise. It's called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri can enter the Union as a slave state. Maine can enter the Union as a free state. And then the rest of the Louisiana Territory will be divided at a latitude line called the 3630 line in the territory. Anything north of that line would stay free, and anything south of that line would be slave. Now, some people wanted the western territories, this includes the new lands that we gained from Mexico, the Mexican cession lands, to use popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that political power belongs to the people, meaning the people would vote on whether they want to have slavery or not. Now, we're going to look at this map right here of the territories, and I will draw a line here. This is the 3630 line right here. Okay? Now, excluding Missouri, of course, anything in the Louisiana Territory north of that line, which would mean this area right up here in this light purple area, that would be free, and anything south of that line of the Louisiana Territory would be slave. That's just this line right here, and it extends only to the Louisiana Territory. This still, over here, is Spanish. We'll get that later. But this is the 3630 line right here. Anything north is free, anything south would be slave. There is a strong movement at this time by people wanting to stop the spread of slavery, especially in the new territories that we're getting out west. One of these people is a representative in Congress whose name is David Wilmot. David Wilmot introduces a document called the Wilmot Proviso. It's kind of like a bill that would basically say that slavery would be prohibited in the western territories. Here is Wilmot right there in the picture. Now, this leads to something that we talked about last year called sectionalism. Sectionalism is favoring the interest of one section or region over the interest of an entire country. So obviously, if we're talking about the South, they like slavery, where most Northerners don't like slavery. And the Southerners would want to see laws or have favorable laws passed that would help them with slavery. Northerners, of course, especially abolitionists like David Wilmot, will use their agenda, being a Northerner, to try to stop the spread of slavery. That's what we're talking about with sectionalism. Slavery is a sectional issue. So you have anti-slavery Northerners who decide they are going to form their own political party called the Free Soil Party. The whole idea of free soil means that they want the lands out west to be free, not slave. And the Free Soil Party would be formed to support the Wilmot Proviso. Now, the Wilmot Proviso will not pass Congress, so it doesn't actually become a bill, but this is just an example of an attempt by people in the North to stop the spread of slavery. More issues are going to arise when the territory of California is ready to become a state. Now, we just got California, but think about this for a second. The population of California exploded. Maybe you can think of why California gained so much population so quickly. I'll let you think about that for a second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And time's up. The correct answer would be the California Gold Rush. The Gold Rush sent thousands of people out to California, so that meant that California had the population to ask for statehood. But there was no other territory who had the population to come in at the same time as California. And California would enter as a free state. So Henry Clay will get at it again and form another compromise Remember, I mentioned before that Henry Clay is known as the Great Compromiser because he came up with all these different ideas to try to stop the country from splitting over the issue of slavery. So anyway, Senator Henry Clay will offer something called the Compromise of 1850. There's 5 parts to this. The first part is that California would enter the Union as a free state. The second step is that the Mexican cession land, this is the land that we got from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. This is the land right here that we're talking about. Those 2 territories would use the issue of popular sovereignty to choose whether they want slavery or not. Of course, that land, that Mexican cession land, was divided into 2 territories, the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory. The third part is about Texas. Texas recently entered the Union after being an independent country for about 10 years. And they had some border disputes once they joined the Union with the New Mexico Territory. So, as part of the compromise, Texas would give up some of the land that they were arguing about, and in return, the United States government would pay off the rest of Texas's debts that they had incurred when they were an independent country. The fourth part of the compromise is about the slave trade. It was banned or ended in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. That does not mean that slavery ended in Washington, D.C. It just means that you could not trade or buy slaves in the nation's capital. The final part of the compromise was probably the most controversial of the 5, and that is a more effective fugitive slave law would be passed. With this slave law, it basically said that any northerner had to help southerners return runaway slaves. There would be stiff penalties if you helped slaves run away. So northerners just were outraged by this particular part of the compromise. 4 important people will be part of this whole compromise of 1850 and getting it passed. We've already talked about Henry Clay. He's started the whole process of the compromise, but during this process, he does get sick and will be too weak to carry on with it. And I think he eventually dies during the course of all this, the debate. 3 other guys are going to get involved. 1, John Calhoun. He was, if you remember, the vice president under Andrew Jackson for a while. And he didn't like the Compromise of 1850. He felt like it took too much away from southern states. So he argued that the southern states, especially South Carolina, his home state, should secede from the Union. To secede means to formally withdraw. And just because he didn't like the compromise. That's him right there in the picture. Here on the left is a guy named Daniel Webster. He's a senator from Massachusetts. He obviously was in favor of the plan. He may not have liked the Fugitive Slave Act, but it did give more states freedom in the Union. And then we have Stephen Douglas right here, who will carry on for Henry Clay. He is going to take up Henry Clay's cause and get the Compromise of 1850 passed through Congress. Let's talk a little bit more about the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed with the Compromise of 1850. It made it a crime to help runaway slaves and allowed officials to arrest runaway slaves in free states. Suspected fugitives were sent to a U.S. Commissioner's office, who would kind of go on a trial, if you will, and usually the judge or the commissioner involved in this case would get some kind of money for trying the case. Now, if the suspected runaway was found not guilty, then of course the commissioner would get a fee, but it was a small fee. If the commissioner found the suspected runaway slave guilty, then the commissioner received more money. So what do you think would happen? The commissioner's office probably put more people back in slavery, or put people in slavery who weren't slaves originally, just so they can get more money. Here are some reactions to the Fugitive Slave Act. African Americans in the North especially felt danger because, a lot of innocent African Americans in the North were being sent to the South as slaves, even though they weren't ever slaves. So many of them fled to Canada. Northerners, of course, are upset about this act because they feel like they're now part of the slave system because they are supposed to help return runaway slaves. An example of this is a fugitive slave named Anthony Burns. He ran away from slavery. He made it all the way up to Boston, where he was captured. And then, of course, he was arrested and sent back into slavery in 1854. Anthony Burns, his case convinced many Northerners to join in the abolitionist movement. Remember, the abolitionist movement is a group of people trying to end slavery all over the United States. Beyond the abolitionist movement, we have Northerners who are writing literature about the horrors of slavery. One of those authors would be a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote a famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was very influential back in this time period, and especially in 1852 when it was published. The book sold more than 2 million copies, and it told of the harsh realities of slavery. Now, she did not own slaves. She was from the North, but she had visited the South and saw the treatment of slaves, so that's when she wrote this book of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is basically about a slave who helps some female slaves run away. When Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he introduced her as the little lady who made a big war. So obviously Lincoln met Stowe while the Civil War was going on. This book, I mean, you can't blame the book for causing a war, but it was just one more thing that the South hated about the North, because this book, the 2 million copies that were sold were mainly by the North. Not many Southerners bought it, and they obviously thought it was fiction because they don't believe that what she wrote about was actually true. That ends Section 1.